I remember it like it happened yesterday. My husband David and I were sitting in our cozy living room, the kind of evening where the world feels quiet, and the only sounds are the crackling fireplace and the occasional rustle of a blanket. We'd been married for 10 years, a decade of highs, lows, and everything in between. David was my best friend, my rock, and my partner in crime, or so I thought. That night, David looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite place. It wasn't anger or sadness. It was something off. He cleared his throat and said, "Honey, there's something I've been thinking about." Naturally, I braced myself for the usual talk about bills, work stress, or maybe even a surprise vacation. Wishful thinking, I know. But what came out of his mouth made my heart drop. "What would you think about spending time with someone else?" he asked. His voice steady but his eyes avoiding mine. I laughed nervously, waiting for the punchline. "Spending time. Like with friends?" "No," he said firmly, his gaze finally locking onto mine. "I mean, what if you connected with another man, just for one night?" For a second I thought I misheard him. This was David, the man who once got jealous because a waiter smiled too much while taking my order. And now he was suggesting, what exactly? I felt my face flush. "What are you talking about?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. David leaned forward, his tone soft but insistent. "I've been reading about this thing couples do. They bring someone else into their relationship to spice things up." My stomach churned. Spice things up. Was he bored with me? Did he think I wasn't enough? And then he dropped another bombshell. "There's this guy I know, Jerome. We work out at the same gym. I think he'd be perfect." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. David had already picked someone. Jerome, a man I'd only seen in passing. Tall and confident, with a presence that filled any room he walked into. "David, have you lost your mind?" I snapped, standing up so quickly that my blanket fell to the floor. "This is insane." But instead of backing down, David remained calm, almost unnervingly so. "Just think about it," he said. "I wouldn't suggest this if I didn't think it could bring us closer." Closer? How could something like this bring us closer? My mind raced with questions and emotions. Shock, confusion, anger, and even a twinge of curiosity I wasn't ready to admit. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. David's words replayed in my head, and a part of me feared what this suggestion meant for our marriage. Was this the beginning of the end? Or was there something I wasn't seeing? As the days went on, David didn't bring it up again, but his suggestion lingered like a shadow in the room. And just when I thought I'd pushed it out of my mind, Jerome appeared, in a way I never expected. Days passed, and I convinced myself that David's suggestion was just a weird phase, a bizarre idea he'd let go of once reality set in. But then, one Saturday morning, David casually announced, "Jerome's coming over for dinner tonight." I froze mid-sip of my coffee. "What?" "He's never had a home-cooked meal since moving here," David explained, his tone too cheerful for my liking. "I thought it'd be nice to invite him over. No pressure, of course. Just dinner." "No pressure," I muttered under my breath, feeling a mix of annoyance and apprehension. This wasn't just dinner, it was a test, wasn't it? A way for David to plant seeds for his ridiculous idea. That evening, I found myself nervously chopping vegetables in the kitchen, mentally preparing for whatever awkwardness lay ahead. The doorbell rang, and I heard David's booming voice greet Jerome like they were old friends. When I finally stepped out of the kitchen to greet our guest, I stopped in my tracks. Jerome was even more striking up close, tall, broad-shouldered, with a smooth confidence that radiated from him. He had a warm smile and kind eyes that seemed to linger just a second longer than they should. "Hi," I said, forcing a polite smile. "Pleasure to finally meet you," Jerome said, his voice deep and rich as he extended a hand. His grip was firm, and for a moment, I felt a spark of something I couldn't quite place. Dinner was surprisingly enjoyable. Jerome was funny, charming, and had an effortless way of making conversation. He talked about his job as a fitness trainer, his love of cooking, a fact David conveniently omitted, and his experiences growing up in a small southern town. David seemed unusually quiet, watching me and Jerome interact with an intensity that made me uneasy. I tried to ignore it, focusing instead on being a gracious hostess. But as the night went on, I couldn't help but notice how Jerome's attention lingered on me, complimenting my cooking, asking questions about my hobbies, and laughing a little too heartily at my jokes. When Jerome finally left, David turned to me with a knowing look. "He's a great guy, isn't he?" I crossed my arms, glaring at him. "Don't start, David. It was just dinner." But David wasn't deterred. "You two got along really well. You see what I mean now? This doesn't have to be a bad thing." I shook my head, unable to believe what I was hearing. "Do you even hear yourself? You're practically throwing me at another man." David sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I'm not throwing you at anyone. I want us to be happy, to try something different. Jerome's not a stranger anymore. He's someone we can trust." His words hung in the air, heavy and unsettling. I didn't know what scared me more, David's persistence or the tiny, shameful part of me that wondered what it might be like to step outside the lines of my carefully drawn life. The next morning, Jerome sent me a text. "Thanks for the great dinner last night. David's lucky to have you." I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. Why was he texting me directly? And why did his message make me feel something? I told myself it was harmless, just a polite thank you, but deep down, I knew this was the beginning of something far more complicated. Jerome's text stayed in my mind all day, no matter how much I tried to shake it off. It wasn't the words themselves, they were polite enough. It was the way they made me feel. Flattered, seen, like someone had noticed me in a way I hadn't felt in years. I didn't respond at first, telling myself it was better to let it go. But by lunchtime, curiosity got the better of me. I sent a quick reply. "Thanks for coming over. Glad you enjoyed it." It was innocent, right? Nothing wrong with a friendly thank you. But when Jerome replied almost instantly with, "You're an amazing host. Can't wait to hang out again," I felt a flicker of guilt. David had no idea we were texting. And while I wasn't hiding it exactly, I wasn't rushing to tell him either. A week later, David brought Jerome up again, this time while we were driving to the grocery store. "You know," he began casually, "Jerome mentioned you guys had a good chat over dinner." I kept my eyes on the road, gripping the steering wheel a little tighter. "It was just small talk. Nothing big." David nodded but didn't let it drop. "He said you're easy to talk to." Thought that was nice. I couldn't tell if he was fishing for something or genuinely trying to ease me into this bizarre idea of his. Either way, I wasn't taking the bait. Later that week, Jerome texted again. This time it wasn't just polite chit-chat. "Hey, I'm trying out this new recipe tonight. Thought of you since you're such a great cook. Want the recipe?" Felt harmless enough, so I said yes. One recipe turned into a conversation about our favorite foods, then into stories about his childhood, and before I knew it, we'd been texting for an hour. I told myself there was nothing wrong with it. After all, David knew Jerome, he trusted him, and it's not like anything was happening. But then Jerome started dropping hints that made me pause. "Wish I could have a cook like you around all the time," he wrote one evening. I stared at the message, unsure how to respond. Was he flirting? Or was I reading too much into it? The real shock came a few days later. David came home from work and handed me his phone. "Jerome said he wants to invite us to his place for dinner this weekend," he announced, grinning. I took the phone, reading Jerome's message. It was friendly, straightforward, nothing out of the ordinary. But knowing the private conversations Jerome and I had been having, I felt a pang of guilt. "Do you want to go?" David asked. I hesitated, unsure of what to say. If I declined, it might make things awkward. But if I agreed, I wasn't sure how I'd handle being around Jerome with David right there. "Sure," I said finally, forcing a smile. "Why not?" That Saturday, we arrived at Jerome's apartment. It was sleek and modern, with an open floor plan and large windows that let in the evening light. He greeted us warmly, his smile a little too lingering as he looked at me. Dinner was delicious. Jerome was just as talented a cook as he'd claimed, but there was an undercurrent to the evening, a tension I couldn't ignore. Every time Jerome's eyes met mine, it felt like he was saying something without words. David, oblivious as ever, seemed to enjoy himself. He even joked about how Jerome and I should team up to open a restaurant. "You'd make a great team," he said, laughing as he sipped his wine. Jerome raised his glass. His eyes locked on mine. "I'd like that." The words were innocent enough, but the way he said them sent a shiver down my spine. That night at Jerome's apartment stuck with me long after we left. There was something about the way he looked at me, the way he spoke, that felt charged, like a current running just beneath the surface. David, on the other hand, seemed completely unfazed. On the drive home, he kept going on about Jerome's cooking skills and how we should have him over more often. "He's a great guy," David said, his voice full of enthusiasm. "And he clearly likes you." I almost choked on my breath. "What's that supposed to mean?" David laughed, a casual, almost dismissive sound. "Just that you two get along really well. Isn't that a good thing?" I didn't answer, staring out the window instead. Part of me wanted to scream at him for being so naive. Or was he? Maybe this was all part of his plan, the one he'd hinted at weeks ago. The next morning, Jerome texted me again. "Had a great time last night. You looked stunning, by the way." I stared at the screen, my heart racing. It was the first time he'd said something outright flirtatious, and it felt like a line had been crossed. I should have ignored it, shut it down. But instead I found myself typing back, "Thanks, Jerome. Dinner was amazing. You're a fantastic cook." I told myself it was just a compliment, nothing serious. But deep down I knew it wasn't that simple. The messages between Jerome and me became more frequent after that. Little inside jokes, compliments, and stories about our days. It wasn't anything physical, but emotionally, it felt like I was walking a tightrope. One evening, while David was out running errands, Jerome called me. Hearing his voice on the other end of the line felt intimate in a way I wasn't prepared for. "I hope I'm not bothering you," he said, his tone smooth and warm. "No, not at all," I replied, even though my stomach was in knots. We talked for almost an hour about everything and nothing. But by the end of the call, I felt a mix of exhilaration and guilt that I couldn't shake. When David came home, he noticed right away that something was off. "You okay?" he asked, setting down the groceries. "Yeah, just tired," I lied, avoiding his gaze. But David wasn't convinced. "You sure? You seem distracted." "I'm fine," I insisted, forcing a smile. "Just a long day." David let it go, but his concern stayed with me. For all his flaws and his bizarre ideas, he still cared about me. And here I was, engaging in conversations I knew he wouldn't approve of. The next time David brought up Jerome, it wasn't about dinner or recipes. It was about something far more unsettling. "You know," he began, sitting down beside me on the couch. "Jerome told me he thinks you're incredible." My heart skipped a beat. "He said that?" David nodded, a strange look in his eyes. "He admires you, your kindness, your humor. He said you're the kind of person who makes people feel at ease." I didn't know what to say. Was this David's way of pushing me closer to Jerome? Or was he just sharing a compliment? Then he said something that left me speechless. "I think you should spend some time with him. Just the two of you." I stared at him, my mouth dry. "What are you talking about?" David leaned back, his expression calm but unreadable. "I trust you and I think this could be good for us. For you." For a moment I thought he was joking. But the look in his eyes told me he was completely serious. "David," I said, my voice shaking, "this isn't normal. Couples don't do this." "Some do," he countered. "And it makes them stronger." I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to scream at him, to tell him he was crazy. But another part, one I wasn't ready to admit to, wondered if he was right. David's suggestion haunted me for days. Every time I thought about it, my stomach twisted into knots. How could he possibly think this was a good idea? And worse, why was he so insistent? I tried to push it out of my mind, But Jerome wasn't making it any easier. His texts became more frequent, more personal. He'd ask how my day was going, send me pictures of meals he was cooking, and occasionally drop compliments that were starting to feel less casual and more intentional. One evening as I sat alone in the living room scrolling through my phone, Jerome's name lit up my screen again. Asterisk, I can't stop thinking about the way you smiled at dinner the other night. You have this energy about you that's hard to ignore. Asterisk, I stared at the message, my heart pounding. This wasn't harmless anymore. I knew it, and yet I couldn't bring myself to shut it down. Instead I typed back, Jerome, I don't think this is appropriate, but before I could hit send, David walked into the room. Who are you texting? He asked, glancing at my phone. No one, I said quickly, locking the screen and setting it down. David gave me a curious look but didn't press further. Instead, he sat down beside me and said, Jerome mentioned he might stop by this weekend. I told him it was fine. I felt my chest tighten. David, you're pushing this too far. He looked at me, his expression calm but firm. Am I, or are you just afraid of what it could mean for us? I stood up, unable to sit there and listen to him justify something that felt so wrong. I'm not afraid of anything. I just don't understand why you think this is okay. David sighed, running a hand through his hair. I just want us to be happy, to explore things we've never considered before. You said yourself that things have felt routine lately. Routine, sure. Life had its ups and downs, but that didn't mean I wanted to blow up my marriage for some misguided experiment. The tension between us lingered for days, and by the time the weekend rolled around, I felt like I was on the edge of a cliff, teetering between loyalty and temptation. When Jerome showed up that Saturday, I was a bundle of nerves. He greeted David warmly, but when he looked at me, his smile was different, softer, more knowing. As the evening went on, David seemed determined to make things comfortable. He encouraged Jerome and me to sit together on the couch while he busied himself in the kitchen. At one point, Jerome leaned in and said, You seem tense. Are you okay? I forced a smile, nodding. I'm fine. But I wasn't fine. I was trapped in a situation that felt increasingly impossible to navigate. When David finally rejoined us, he had a bottle of wine in hand. Let's make a toast, he said, pouring glasses for all three of us. To new experiences, he said, raising his glass. Jerome's eyes flickered toward me as he clinked his glass against mine. To new experiences. The rest of the evening was a blur. David seemed relaxed, almost unnervingly so, while I felt like I was suffocating. By the time Jerome left, I was emotionally drained. That night, as I lay in bed beside David, I couldn't hold it in any longer. Why are you doing this? I whispered, my voice breaking. David turned to me, his expression soft. Because I love you and I think this could bring us closer. Closer, the word echoed in my mind as tears filled my eyes. How could something that felt so wrong possibly bring us closer? I barely slept that night, my mind racing with everything that had happened. David's words played on a loop in my head. I love you and I think this could bring us closer. Closer to what? To disaster. The next morning I woke up feeling like I was drowning. David acted as if nothing was wrong, making coffee and chatting about his plans for the day while I sat at the kitchen table in a fog. And then, as if on cue, Jerome texted. Asterisk, good morning, beautiful. I hope today brings you as much joy as you bring others. Asterisk. I stared at the message, my stomach twisting into knots. This was too much, too far. I had to end this, whatever this even was. I typed back, Jerome, we need to talk. He replied instantly. Asterisk, of course. When and where? Asterisk. After a moment of hesitation I sent. Asterisk, today. Somewhere public. Coffee shop. Asterisk. We agreed to meet that afternoon at a small cafe on the edge of town. I didn't tell David. I didn't even know how to explain it to him without making things worse. When I arrived, Jerome was already there, waiting at a table by the window. He stood when he saw me, his smile warm and inviting. Thanks for meeting me, he said as I sat down. I nodded, taking a deep breath. Jerome, I think we need to clear the air. He tilted his head, his expression unreadable. About what? You know what, I said, my voice trembling. The texts, the calls. It's starting to feel like more than just friendly conversation. Jerome leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady. And what if it is? His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I had expected him to deny it, to brush it off as harmless, but his honesty left me speechless. I'm married, I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper, to a man who seems determined to push us together for reasons I don't understand. Jerome's expression softened. I know and I respect that. But I also know what I feel when I'm around you. And I think you feel it too. My heart pounded as I stared at him, torn between anger, confusion, and something I didn't want to name. I can't do this, I said, shaking my head. Whatever this is, it's not right. Jerome leaned forward, his voice low and sincere. I'm not asking you to do anything you're not ready for. But I need you to know that I'm here for whatever you need. His words were both a comfort and a temptation, and I hated how much they affected me. I need space, I said finally, standing up. Please don't text me anymore. Jerome nodded, his expression somber. I understand. As I walked out of the cafe, I felt a strange mix of relief and regret. I had drawn a line, but I wasn't sure how long I could hold it. When I got home, David was waiting for me, his arms crossed and a knowing look on his face. You met with him, didn't you? He asked, his voice calm but firm. My heart sank. How did you know? I saw the messages, he said simply, and I wanted to see what you'd do. I felt a wave of anger and betrayal. You were testing me. Spying on me. David shook his head. I wasn't spying. I was trying to understand. And now I see that you're struggling as much as I am. Struggling with what? Snap. You're the one who started all this. David sighed, running a hand through his hair. I wanted to shake things up, to break us out of this rut we've been in. But maybe I went about it the wrong way. His words hung in the air, and for the first time I saw a flicker of doubt in his eyes. I love you, he said softly. And I just want us to be happy. Can you believe that? I didn't know what to say. Everything felt so tangled, so far from the life we'd built together. Then stop pushing, I said finally, my voice trembling. Let me figure this out on my own. David nodded, his expression heavy with emotion. Okay, I'll back off. But please don't shut me out. I turned away, unable to face him any longer. The days that followed were some of the hardest of my life. David kept his word and gave me space, but his presence lingered like a shadow. Every time I looked at him, I could feel the weight of everything unspoken between us. And then there was Jerome. Though I had asked him not to contact me, I couldn't stop thinking about him. His words, his warmth, the way he made me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt in years. One night, as I sat alone in the living room scrolling mindlessly through my phone, I came across an old picture of David and me. It was from the early days of our marriage, before things got complicated, before life dulled the spark we once had. I stared at the photo, tears welling up in my eyes. What had happened to us? How had we gotten to this point? The next morning, I woke up determined to confront everything head-on. No more avoiding. No more running. It was time to lay it all out, David, Jerome, and, most importantly, myself. I started with David. We need to talk, I said, standing in the doorway of the kitchen as he poured his coffee. He looked up, his eyes filled with a mix of hope and apprehension. Okay. I'm listening. I took a deep breath, my hands trembling. I can't do this anymore. The games, the pushing, the expectations. It's not who we are. Or at least it's not who I want us to be. David set his mug down, his face serious. I was just trying to help, to give us something new. I know, I said, my voice breaking. But you didn't stop to think about how it would make me feel. You didn't ask if it was what I wanted. He nodded slowly, his shoulders sagging. You're right. I didn't. And I'm sorry. The apology caught me off guard, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like we were on the same page. I need to rebuild this with you, I said, tears streaming down my face. But on our terms, not anyone else's. David stepped forward, pulling me into a hug. We'll figure it out, he whispered. Together. It was a small moment, but it felt monumental. Later that day, I knew I had one more conversation to have, this time with Jerome. I texted him asking if we could meet one last time. He agreed, and we met at the same cafe where this whirlwind had truly begun. Jerome smiled when he saw me, but there was a sadness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. I didn't think I'd hear from you again, he said as I sat down. I took a deep breath, my heart pounding. Jerome, I care about you. Really do. But this, whatever it is between us, it has to end. He nodded slowly, his gaze steady. I understand. But can I ask you something? Of course, I said. Do you think you would have felt the same way if things were different? If circumstances weren't what they are? His question hit me like a freight train. The truth was I didn't know. But it didn't matter. What mattered was the life I had chosen, the vows I had made. I don't know, I admitted. But I can't live in what-ifs. I have to focus on what's real. Jerome smiled softly, though there was a hint of sadness in it. You're stronger than you realize. As I walked away from the cafe, I felt a strange mix of relief and heartbreak. It wasn't easy to let go, but it was necessary. When I got home, David was waiting for me. He didn't ask where I'd been, and I didn't offer an explanation. Instead, we sat down together, side by side, and began the slow process of rebuilding what we had almost lost.